Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Great Food Challenge, a three-part digital event series. I'm Mike Barry, 19 years leading the sustainability journey at the retailer Marks & Spencer, and also working at the Consumer Goods Forum to bring the world's biggest food and drink companies together to tackle issues like deforestation, plastics and food waste, human rights and supply chains. And I'm delighted to be the host for this webinar series. Now look, over the last 10 years, the world food system has been under enormous pressure as it's faced into the climate crisis, deforestation, water loss, but also huge human challenges as well to do with poverty, inequality and well-being as well. And now we have COVID, where the pandemic has only made things worse. So over this series, we want to explore both the challenges and the solutions to building a new food system for the future. Now look, today's first session is very much about food inequality. We're going to be looking at something that's going to double over the next 12 months, where climate change and COVID meet, putting more and more people, tens of millions of people, into difficult positions with food. We've got two great moderated sessions that we're going to be running now to explore the issues and the solutions. But before we go on, a little bit of housekeeping. Let me just introduce our host for today, Climate Action. Formed in 2007, Climate Action brings together civil society, business and government to co-create the solutions we need to do for the future. And that's what they've been doing over the last decade, hosting events and creating a digital platform that makes us stronger together. Now look, let me just sort of reflect on some of the what's going to be happening over the next 12 months with COP26 as well. COVID caused us to postpone a really important climate negotiation in Glasgow. Due for this year, it's going to be put out to November 2021. And Climate Action is running a much bigger COP26 roadmap session in the run-up to that to bring us all together to work again to be stronger in terms of understanding the challenges and solutions. And the Great Food Challenge is part of that. So before I plunge on, I just wanted to introduce a little bit of housekeeping for all of us. Firstly, the session is going to be recorded. So let's make sure that you can use this for catch-up as well. Subsequent to the event, you don't have to take it all in today. I want you to visit the virtual expo. I want you to use the platform to connect with each other. Again, thousands of voices on this call. You've all got ideas, bounce them off each other, co-create solutions. And don't forget to use climateaction.org as well as a place that you can go to follow what's happening by the hour, by the week, by the month, by the year, as the world around us changes very, very rapidly. And then let me come to questions as well. We've got 6 brilliant speakers today, outstanding, but they haven't got all the answers. Many of the answers that we need might lie amongst you, the audience, and we want to feel that you can put your questions to the speakers and be part of the conversation. And there's a couple of platforms you can use to get involved. We've got the actual application you're sat on now, use the Q&A function, or you can use Twitter as well, using the hashtag #ClimateActionLive to make sure you get your point across. And if you do ask a question, make sure you tell us who you are, where you're from, what your question is, keep it brief, and to whom it might be posted as well. So that's the housekeeping. I'm delighted now that we're going to start the first moderated session. And it's going to be led by the Deputy Director General of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. Delighted that Helena Samedo is joining us for this session. Deputy Director General, if I can invite you to join me on the stage. You've got 30 years of experience in global food system, and crucially, you've helped hundreds of millions of people have a voice. The dispossessed, rural poor and women, bringing them into the discussion about the food system we need for the future. Now, I think we're hoping to dial in the Ambassador Sacco to join us as well as David Nabarro. If the Ambassador's unable to join us at this stage, we'll dial her in just as soon as we can later in the webinar. But Deputy Director General, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. I am very pleased that these virtual events allow so many of us to connect from all around the world and today to discuss food security and the global recovery with our special guest, my dear friend and colleague, David Nabarro. David, usually he is the one interviewing me, and today we change roles, David. He is very well known, but let me introduce him. David is the co-director of the Imperial College Institute of Global Health Innovation at the Imperial College London and supports system leadership for sustainable development through his Switzerland-based social enterprise, 4SD. From March 2020, David has been Special Envoy of WHO Director General in COVID-19. David has been always on the spot when we have major pandemics. He secured his medical qualification in 1974 and has worked in over 50 countries in communities, hospitals, governments, civil society, university, and different leadership roles in the United Nations. But before we get started, let me first highlight a couple of important points. As the world faces the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, we must recognize and value the deep connection between people and planet. And I think the introduction call our attention in the linkage with climate and human. Climate change with extreme events such as droughts, floods, forest fires is creating more challenge to food security, with damaging consequences to this connection. COVID-19 has also underlined that despite all our technological advance, we are dependent on healthy ecosystem for our health and our food. The loss and degradation of our ecosystems and biodiversity are increasing the risk and exposure of people to emerging diseases, as COVID-19 has only exacerbated already fragile situation, disrupting food systems and threatening to turn a global health emergency into a global food emergency. Just to share with you some figures, before the COVID outbreak, hunger was already on highs. In 2019, almost 690 million people, nearly 1 in 10 people in the world, went hungry. And according to the recent published State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2020, the pandemic may push an additional 130 million people in the world into chronic hunger by the end of the year. Restoring the links between people and nature is thus vital to feed the world in a sustainable manner. We need to do more to combat climate change. We must ensure that our food systems are an important part of the solution to climate change. But we need to work hand in hand and face the food, health, and climate nexus to find long-term, transformative, and large-scale solutions that mitigate the immediate impacts of the pandemic while strengthening the resilience of our food systems and livelihoods. COVID-19 has exposed the world's vulnerability and shown that we need to strike a greater balance between nature, food systems, and biodiversity to protect people's health and well-being and increase resilience. As we used to say, we must build back better, or we must build forward. But the question today is how? This is what I will be discussing today with our special guest, my dear friend, David Nabarro. David, again, thank you for joining us today in this discussion. You have worked around the world. I have met you in several countries on very complex issues that span from disease outbreaks to food security, nutrition, climate change. You were one of the organizers of the Climate Summit last year. And today, you are Special Envoy to the Director General of the World Health Organization. So, let me ask you, as countries around the world are implementing their COVID-19 recovery plans. How do we prevent the widening of existing inequalities in food, health, and climate? Please share with us your thoughts on this.
I love that question. I love it because it really hits at the heart of the issues we're dealing with right now. This new virus is really hurting poor people and poor nations. It hurts them because they're more likely to get ill. They're more likely to suffer and even to die. And they're more likely to be affected by the containment measures that are put in place to deal with it. Quite simply, this virus is hurting poor people. And so you are absolutely right that what this virus can do, if we can't get it ahead of it, is actually widen the gaps between people who are wealthy and people who are poor. We see it in different occupations. People who are most likely to get COVID are poor people in low-paid jobs. We see it in access to healthcare. People who are poor find it harder to get tested and harder to get treated. And people who are poor have really suffered when there's been movement restrictions as part of the process of controlling the virus. So, my work with governments, with civil society, with businesses, with health professionals is all about what we can do to reduce the impact of COVID on poor people and poor communities. First, you've got to recognize that this does affect poor people differently from those who are well off. Understand that poor people find it hard to work from home. Sometimes they find it hard to isolate themselves. They may find it hard to actually practice personal hygiene, washing their hands regularly. And secondly, when control measures are introduced, let's put the needs of poor people first, and let's make certain that they're properly protected. For example, when people are asked to stop moving and they have to stay at home, poor people who are in the informal economy or on daily wages are the first to be hurt. Let's make sure that we put everything possible in place so that they can get enough cash to live, so that they can get food for their families, and so that they can actually also be first in line for getting back to work when opportunities arise. Sometimes I'm seeing that actually poor people are the first to lose their jobs as businesses restructure themselves after COVID. This last point, Maria, this is a problem because I actually don't think enough people who are making decisions in our world realize just how much COVID is affecting poor people and how much their lives are being turned upside down. So a lot of what we all have to do is just to remind decision makers that not everybody is the same when threatened by COVID. For poor people, it can actually be a force that will push them into extreme poverty or might even lead to starvation and have really severe consequences. So let's make sure that every decision maker understands that COVID is a disease of poverty and inequity and acts on it.
Thank you, David. And let me build on what you just said. How we can reach the decision makers that they need to really target as matter of priority the poor people and come up with some solutions where they can protect their livelihoods, they can protect their health. How you see the measures, if you are an advisor of a minister, of a president, what should be the solutions in order to protect this group of people? And
Thank-
another question, maybe you can reply together. What is
Yeah.
the role of the business, the private sector in this building back better? And also you
Yeah.
talk about the producers of food. What
Yeah.
for the farmers? What you envisage? Because they are also affected.
Yes.
If they produce, they cannot sell. Maybe they cannot
Yeah.
even go and produce because of the social measures taken.
Yeah.
How you envisage these global solutions?
Yeah. So, you know, this is a really big challenge that you've given me, because it's not easy to explain to decision makers about the impact of a problem on poor people. Sometimes they get very frustrated. They say, "What are you doing, an outsider, coming and saying, I've got to look to the interests of my poor people? Are you implying that I'm not doing it?" And so I find that often it's good to have a dialogue with decision makers about the nature of the problems they're facing. I've been really impressed listening to some of the leaders in South Africa recently, as they've described to me how COVID started in their country with the more affluent populations and then moved rather nastily into some of the townships and affected really poor people. And listening to them describing it, they were very clear how hard it is for poor people to be able to do what is expected of them to stop the virus from spreading. And I suppose what I found was that actually decision makers want those of us from the international community, like the United Nations, or from other governments and organizations. They want us to understand the nature of the problem they face. And they want us to support them because they know that you can't deal with COVID without actually helping people to respond to the virus. The virus is the enemy and people are the solution. You can't deal with COVID without having data on where the virus is. You can't deal with COVID without giving people what they need to be able to change their behavior and get ahead of the virus. And so by having a dialogue, I think we're better able to understand that there is no alternative but to actually address the challenges faced by poor people that put them at risk. I'll go to another country example. I've been talking with people in some European countries, and I've been saying we need to understand that the people who seem to be most at risk of this virus at this time are people in low-paid factory employment, particularly food factories. They're very cold places, and they're not very easy places to work in. And the people who work there are often on quite insecure employment. And we've been working out with the employers and with local government, what can we do to help? An example, you don't really want people with COVID to come to work because they can infect others at work. So you ask them, stay away. But they say to you, hang on, I get in UK £400 a week, for working in a food processing plant. I get £94 a week if I'm on sick pay. So if I'm ill, the incentive is for me to go to work. But the factory boss is saying, well, actually, we don't want you to come to work because we don't want clusters of COVID building up in our factory. So the employee says to the boss, okay, but you're only paying me a quarter if I stay away. And I've got bills to pay. I've got household to feed. And I'm not rich. So, if you want me to stay away, you've got to compensate me for my loss of earnings. Now, not every country can do this, but just simply breaking it down and looking at the issue from the perspective of the person, we see very quickly that it's really hard to deal with these factory outbreaks of COVID in Europe, for example, unless we also pay attention to the economic incentives for people to come to work. And that therefore means that there is a hugely important role for everybody to come together to deal with this COVID. Local authorities, that's local government, businesses, civil society, religious organizations, which could be the church, the synagogue, the mosque, or wherever. And then we also want to get the health people involved as well. And by bringing people together at local level and making sure that business is there alongside the authorities, we're seeing how in more and more places, it's possible to get a good integrated response to this threat, with very much attention to the local level and to the conditions under which poor people are having to live. I'm really wanting to acknowledge that good businesses are working as part of the solution. They've realized that this virus isn't going to go away. We can't really talk about post-COVID. We have to talk about living with COVID, being ready for COVID. We have to talk about everybody coming together and working with the data and really listening to the people. The businesses that are not part of an integrated response, the businesses that are not listening to their employees, the businesses that are not working out how to keep their customers and their employees safe, the businesses that don't understand the factors that encourage poor people to continue working, these businesses should, in my view, rethink their positioning, because nobody in the world is going to be able to get on top of this virus without the full involvement of local businesses, national businesses, and of international businesses. And now let's come to the food systems. You were so right, Maria, when you were introduced. You told us about how there were farmers who were not able to sell their produce, either because they couldn't transport it to market, or there was nobody wanting to purchase it at the market because so many restaurants and other manufacturing operations had closed because demand was reduced or because of containment measures. We saw this particularly in India. We saw films of dairy farmers throwing away milk, or sometimes throwing away eggs, or having to plough vegetables back into their land, simply because the markets were not right, because the transportation to market was not working. And in some other countries, we've also heard that labourers are available to process the food and to make sure that it was properly looked after. So
Thank you, David. I think it was very clear. Let's move to the other part of our discussion, which is the nexus between food system, biodiversity, and climate. How we can increase the well-being. You have talking about the livelihoods of people, how we should protect people, but at the same time, how we should protect the nature, biodiversity, and climate change in this global equation. And I know climate has also been in your heart.
Yeah. Everybody, it's nice that Maria interrupted me. One of my problems is that I'm very passionate about these issues and I probably talk too much, but don't hesitate to follow up with me through social media if you want to go into it in any greater detail. This relationship between food systems, nature, and climate is so important. Working with others after the Sustainable Development Agenda was introduced in 2015, I sat down and actually 60 of us got together and we said, how can we look at the future of food systems in a responsible, sustainable way? And a bit like Maria said at the beginning, we recognize that food systems is about people and it's about planet. And so we have to understand that you don't have food systems working in isolation. There's a very definite relationship between what happens in the way in which we produce and process food on the one hand, and this situation that we have with ecosystem services and nature on the other hand. A few facts. Much of the shortage of water that we have in the world today, really intense, for example, in California, really intense in Southern Africa, but much of that shortage of water is due to the enormous amount of water that is extracted for food production. Some of the destruction of biodiversity, with numerous species being lost, is because of the way in which we go about our agriculture and our fisheries, and to a degree, the extent to which we seek to control insects and other pests with chemicals, that if we do it without care and without precision, we can actually damage biodiversity. Much of the damage to marine life, particularly on shorelines, is due to the runoff of unused soil nutrients from fertilizer. Now, that doesn't mean that fertilizer is wrong.
David,
It just means
now
we have to use it right.
let us move to our chat. We have so many questions, very
Yeah.
active participants, but I have chosen two. And one saying, we need, I think you have already referred, people-centered solutions that
Yeah.
build resilience. What are aid agencies and development banks doing?
Let's be quick on this one. We'll go to COVID. What happened with COVID, particularly in March, April, May, June, July of this year? Answer, it led to widespread unemployment and people being short of cash. That in turn led to hunger and also malnutrition among children. We don't know how serious it has been, but some estimates say enormous numbers of people have been affected. So therefore, we must, when we have a crisis like this COVID, affecting so many people and making them poorer, we must have strong social protection mechanisms so that as people do get poorer, they are protected. And so a lot of us were advocating for aid agencies, including non-governmental organizations, including governmental aid, including foundations, to actually make sure that more money is available for non-governmental groups and for government agencies to actually protect those whose lives and livelihoods were being affected by COVID containment measures. There wasn't enough done. And we have seen some very serious accounts of people not able to get the food they needed. It improved. It took a number of weeks for the response to improve. But I want to stress that social protection for poor people is absolutely critical. And that applies whether you have a crisis caused by COVID or a crisis caused by locusts. Secondly, and very quickly, a lot of smallholder farmers could not sell their produce and were stuck with it going rotten, as I said earlier. So in those kinds of situations, it's absolutely essential to have systems to actually reduce the debt indebtedness of smallholder farmers and to give them some kind of reprieve on their repayments of their debts, so that they're able to have some rest in and not to be penalized because they haven't got the cash they needed from selling their produce. People-centered, focusing on the poor and dealing with their immediate needs.
Okay. And the second question is, how does COVID-19 and climate change redefine a global food systems that equals food security and zero emission?
So the first thing to say about COVID is that it's shown us the vulnerabilities in food systems and the need to make sure they respond better to the requirements of poor people. But climate change also shows the vulnerabilities of food systems. When bad weather occurs, there's a drought, storm surge, floods. What's the result? Again, it is that poor people can't get the food they need. Poor people also may not be able to produce and then to market their produce. So in the face of both climate change and COVID, resilience is key. Resilience in the face of adverse impacts. But we've got one additional aspect when it comes to climate change, and that is that all our food production and processing needs to be made much, much more efficient in relation to emissions of carbon, in particular represented by different greenhouse gases. If we can get it right, and we can reduce the emissions, and we can take advantage of the reality that many of what we have in our fields in terms of trees or plants also have the capacity to absorb carbon dioxide and to sequester it through photosynthesis. Through investing in nature and getting the right investments in nature, we can do two things: reduce emissions and also sequester carbon. That's why last year, when there was a climate summit, we found countries from all over the world saying to us, we're going to change our systems of agriculture and food. We're going to put more emphasis on agroforestry and agroecology and biodiversity. We're going to put more emphasis on ensuring that we reduce emissions through climate smart agriculture, because we want to be sure that the agriculture of the future is not continuing to contribute 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. So in summary, it's important to focus on the two sides of the climate agenda. One is resilience in the face of changing climates and making sure that all agriculture and food systems are able to cope with the stresses. And number two is making certain that agriculture and food has minimum possible production of greenhouse gases, and at the same time, through introduction of, for example, agroforestry, we're able to sequester as much carbon as possible through agriculture. Agriculture is a massive and important solution to the challenge of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for this conversation. I consider it very interesting, and I am sure the message got along all the public here. Unfortunately, Ambassador Saku couldn't join us due to technical problems, and you had the full stage for you, what I consider it was a huge opportunity. But let me wrap up. I believe it was a very lively conversation, and let me take some points from our conversation. First is that the pandemic has exposed growing inequalities all over the world, and we need to have more coordination, we need to have better policies, and we need to increase resilience. The second is the pandemic has also shown the fragility of our current food systems, undermining our health and our planet's health. We need actions to reduce emission while sustainably producing our food. It has also provided an opportunity to setting us on a better path to recovery, calling for more local production, shorter supply chains, innovative solution. We didn't talk much about innovation, but innovation is of great importance when we are building back better, and we need a more inclusive policies and a greater global cooperation, as David reminded us. With this, I thank you all for being here with us. Thank you very much, David. Very good to see you healthy. Keep safe. And thank you again for joining us on this conversation with the climate action. Thank you.
Obrigado. Thank you very much.
De nada.
Deputy Director General, David, that was astonishing. I could have sat and listened for another 2 hours to that discussion. The humanity by which you put hundreds of millions of the poorest people at the heart of this discussion was amazing. We cannot thank you enough for that. Now, in a moment, we're going to take a break, but I do want to just press to everybody, please ask questions. Use the live application app. Go to the sort of live discussion tab, go to the questions, tell us who you are, what you want to ask, but get involved. Every time you ask a question, it adds to the richness of this discussion. Your views are really, really important to us. Now, in a moment, we're going to take a 2-minute break, very, very brief. And when I come back, we're going to be joined by Diane, Ariadna, and João to discuss how we build that better. We've been set the big challenge. How do we take things forward and solve them? So without further ado, brief break. We'll see you again in 90 seconds. Thank you.